John Kasich made it through the night after losing again in Indiana. Not really his fault. Nobody knows who he is, so that makes it much harder to win an election. So he made it through the night, woke up, and decided that his heart wasn't really in it. We're going to have his statement in just a second. But if you're surprised to find out that he has dropped out today, it might be because even up to today, he was releasing inspirational videos about how he's the only one with any chance of winning. And because this is May the 4th, this is the video he released earlier today.
Study of more than 44,000 Americans across all 50 states reveals that Governor John Kasich is the only GOP presidential contender that could get more electoral, that is, college votes, than Hillary Clinton and beat her in the general election.
The only candidate not disliked by most of the electorate is John Kasich.
He's not hated as much as everybody else. So look, that's the inspirational message that he put out immediately prior to it being leaked that he was going to leave the race.
Yeah.
It's strong messaging. When you put that
If you assume that people sit and read stuff.
Read a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. And also,
where's the chasing?
I guess there's got to be overlap between, I mean, look, Star Wars is a nerdy thing. It's not necessarily a lib thing. I'm sure there's a lot of conservatives who like Star Wars. But the vision that he put forward as like what the Empire is up to, sounded pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. It's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. Like, I don't even hope that all of that would end up happening. But anyway, he puts that out. Then we find out that he's going to leave the race. He waits hours to actually leave. And we're going to play the video in just a second. You're going to see why it took so long. They had to assemble a very complicated, grandiose stage and get a lot of his supporters behind him.
Oh, you just can't walk out in front of a fucking plain wood wall and give a speech.
No, not in like
you
a conference room of a hotel. Like, big.
Or you go laminate if you're going to do wood laminate.
Right.
Wood laminate.
Do wood laminate.
That's what I would do.
You got to dress it up with a lot of flags, some other people around you.
Huge amount of supporters chanting your name.
Yeah, so that takes a while. It takes a while.
It takes a while. So it took until 2, and this is what they came up with.
To paraphrase an old adage, I sought the greatness of America in her harbors and in her rivers, and I did not find it. I sought it in her fertile fields and boundless forests, and did not find it. I sought her greatness in her halls of Congress, and I did not find it. You see, after this campaign, I see it in us. When we come together, when we lift one another with our eyes on the horizon. Throughout my campaign, I have said the Lord may have another purpose for me. And it set all the pundits at Twitter. Does that mean he's not committed or he's not focused or he's not energetic? It showed to some degree how little they understand about life. You see, I have always said that the Lord has a purpose for me as he has for everyone. And as I suspend my campaign today, I have renewed faith, deeper faith, that the Lord will show me the way forward and fulfill the purpose of my life. Thank you, and God bless.
Wow, he got out of there fast. You
Wow.
can almost see like the smoke, like shaped like John Kasich as he jets off the stage.
Yeah, and he got
No
out of there
questions.
without saying the name Donald Trump at all, which is
Exactly.
why he got out of there really fast. He didn't
Because
want
the
to take
obvious question.
Any questions at all. You know, that press conference, he was supposed to have had a press conference today at Dulles Airport in Washington this morning in a secret airplane hangar there. And the press got there to hear John Kasich, and then were told that they're not allowed to film while they were there because of revealing some sort of secret. Then it was learned that Kasich wasn't even showing up, and he was going to be doing this at 5 o'clock in Columbus, and people then began to know, senior campaign officials were saying that he was going to be dropping out. I don't know about you guys, confounding to me. I mean, as confounding as his candidacy.
What changed?
What changed other than for the better for him?
Right.
I did math, and I don't do math well. But if you're going off of the delegates that are available right now, there are 455 of them left. If maybe it's 445. Yeah, I think it's 445 Republican delegates. If John Kasich beat Donald Trump 257 to 188, beat him by 60 some odd. Again, I don't do it well. 69 delegates. He would have stopped Donald Trump from being the nominee.
Yeah.
So, in the states that remain, why not? Why were you in the race in the first place?
If not for that
If
chance.
not for that chance, this was given to you.
Here's what changed. It became more likely that he could do that. And that's what makes it so weird that he left.
Yes.
I mean, he and Ted Cruz, regardless of whatever weird temporary alliances they did or didn't form, were still splitting the vote. And I'm not saying that John Kasich could have beaten him in California or wherever, but he certainly has an easier path without Ted Cruz taking away some of the anti-Trump vote.
And the party has a bigger argument to make. They come into California on June 7th. They say to Californians, hey, Donald Trump is ahead in the latest polling in your state in California. Go back John Kasich. Everyone who's a Republican, back John Kasich. And we might have a chance one-on-one of beating Donald Trump. This is a classic Republican. He's a conservative. I mean, he's more conservative than he was able to show in this race because he was the moderate in this race. But John Kasich is as conservative as they come. And he headed up a budget committee that was really conservative when he was in Congress. Why then, when you have this matchup, does Kasich bow out now? Why'd you get in the race in the first place? And I spent time with Kasich on the trail. You may have, Jimmy, you go to stop with him. People respond to him when he sees them one-on-one. California is an enormous state. There are other states in between which were part of his alliance.
Yeah.
Oregon, I mean, these are Kasich-type states. I don't understand why in the world he did it. And some people are saying, well, he wants to be vice president. Okay. That's going to change in a month from now, right?
Yeah. Well, no, it might change by him winning states and it making it more attractive for him to be chosen as vice president.
Or it might diminish his standing as a vice presidential candidate because he's bashing Donald Trump. So what? I could sit here all day and never really believe that John Kasich wants to be part of a Trump administration. Already today. Go ahead.
I agree. I don't think he wants to, and it doesn't make. I'm just parroting exactly what you were going to say, and it doesn't make any sense. And he doesn't even have to attack Trump. All he has to do is present himself as, I'm a classic conservative, and he's not.
Like he's been doing.
Yeah, that's all he has to do, and say, I'm giving the voters a choice. Majority of Republicans say they don't like him. He has high negatives. Here's your choice. That's all he has to do. Why he's not doing that is mind-boggling.
And what an insult to the people of New Hampshire who made him second, and the people of Ohio where he won, to other candidates who left the race early because he had states that he could do well in.
Yeah.
The people that gave money to his campaign. I mean, this is what last night was what you were waiting for. His opening to stop Trump. If you were part of Never Trump, if you were part of Stop Trump, whatever they call it, this was your opportunity. This candidate was your chance. And it's gone right now. Ben Carson is heading up the Veep search. It was announced today. Yeah. Ben Carson thinks that Ted Cruz should be the Attorney General. Ben Carson thinks that John Kasich, because of Ohio, would be an attractive vice presidential candidate. He would be, but for Donald Trump, I don't know. And I just can't believe that this is what caused him to get out. I thought, oh, well, this is now going to be more interesting with Ted Cruz getting out the Republican race.
He has already on this campaign trail several times said, what the hell has happened to our party? What's going on with our party? What is this? So that's aimed right at Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so for him to now take a position in that administration, I don't think he's that empty of a suit as like Chris Christie or Rubio or
by the way,
somebody
he's
like
not
that.
an empty suit. You may disagree with
Right.
just about everything he says. He is sharp. He comes from from a well-reasoned place, not a knee-jerk place. And he doesn't. He's like everybody, he's got his foibles, but he's a well.
Right,
Thought
he's
of
classic conservative,
classic
all that stuff.
conservative,
He's not. What I'm saying, he's not one of the Chris. He's not all bluster. He's not all. He's actually who he kind
He's
of
a
presents
little bit
himself
more
to
honest.
be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and that makes me wonder, maybe this is being naive or whatever. The guy has always come across as pretty emotional compared to the other candidates he's running against. He looks on the verge of tears a lot. Even when he's debating, like when he is like, he'll give his, what is going on with the party thing? He does it in an honest way. Ted Cruz would deliver that as a line. There might be some honesty to what he's saying. I mean, when he says his heart isn't in it, maybe he's being honest. Maybe he's just sick of it. Maybe he doesn't want to face the full brunt of Donald Trump's
total
attacks.
dishonesty for the last months. I want to be president.
Well,
I want to be
if
president.
he's
I
an
want to be a
emotional guy,
chance.
his
I'm the one who
emotions
can beat him.
change.
I can do right. Well, that's true too. I mean, I want to get this to the only place we can win this race against Donald Trump is on the floor of the convention. Now, beat him by 69 delegates, and you're on the floor of the convention without anybody challenging, without anybody having enough delegates, and you can challenge. And to me, it's mind-boggling. I mean, I've watched this campaign and thought it was a very interesting, weird, his campaign, the Kasich campaign, a weird campaign, because all he's done is stayed in the race just to be the last man standing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And here it is.
This is the moment.
So what about who else have you talked to that everyone feels the same way?
The majority of the people I've spoken with feel the same way, other than people who think that Cruz and Kasich spoke last week. They actually did meet. No, people wondered if they had actually met. They spoke to one another. They went their ways in this divided alliance. There are people that think maybe they said, if we cannot beat him in Indiana, if you can't beat him, Ted, in Indiana, we're both going to get out. I don't know that I buy that. I don't know that that's true, that they had that kind of an agreement. Because if you can't beat him in Indiana and Trump has this, be the spoiler elsewhere. It's a month. You don't have that much longer to stick around.
I mean, that just begs the question, why would you then make that agreement?
Right.
Like, that agreement might be why you're leaving, but why did you say that at all?
Right. So
for the same reason.
There are two people that talked about that meeting and that this was preordained at that meeting. I don't believe that that's the case, and I don't believe, because of what you just said too, John. I just don't see how that makes any kind of sense. I don't know why this man was in this race if yesterday scared him out of it.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe the only crazy, this crazy idea is that Trump's paying them off. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't think
You
that,
start to wonder if there might be something.
But I just want to make one.
I don't start to wonder that. I mean,
I'm kidding.
No, I know. But I mean, there's something weird. Like, you start to wonder if there's something weird going on. Yeah, because this is the day that he's waited for.
Yeah.
And
Maybe like 40 years ago, his father was in a picture with the guy who shot Reagan. And he's worried that Trump's going to make hay out of it.
There you
Yeah.
go. Well, you know what's funny about you? I heard the same thing, that he was first going to be at Dulles Airport, but then they switched it to Dore Airport, which was. But if you notice what he's doing there in dropping out of the race, is he does that thing. It's like, it's not that I'm unpopular or that I did anything wrong. It's that God wants me to do something else. This is, I'm in tight with God. And I forgot, I missed a call, I guess, a few weeks ago and whatever, but now I got it. Now I'm just going to go call God and he's going to tell me what I'm supposed to do. I'm special. God has a plan for me. I'm still super cool. He planned for me to be governor already. God plans everything for me. So this isn't about me. This is about God. And I'm down with God. It's such a, to me...
He is very secretly religious, too.
Yeah.
John Kasich goes to religion a lot more, again, because of the people that were in this race. They painted this picture of John Kasich as, he's the one... and these polls, the polls that say Kasich is the only one that could have beaten Clinton or Sanders, he's the one that consistently can do better against the Democrat. I never believe those polls,
Really?
because so much can change. No, I don't believe. I mean, could he do
Well, he'd
better?
be starting
Maybe.
off at a
but
much
I don't
better
believe
position.
polls that say this person against this person in a hypothetical matchup 6 months before they go to the polls. I just don't. I think those are the worst.
Studies have
polls
shown that
in polling.
around April they start to actually have predictive power.
Yeah, but they've been wrong the past two cycles, and they've been wildly wrong and wildly divergent. So I don't think those polls matter as much as a lot of people think that they do, because I think that there are obviously things that happen between now and then that change a lot, in terms of surrogates, in terms of. But the notion that John Kasich would be more appealing to an independent or moderate voter or a Democrat who didn't have the stomach to vote for Hillary Clinton, that's indisputable.
Yeah.
You know, that's indisputable. And it's...
They really... I mean, there was nothing that the party could have done, but they really screwed themselves over in not being able to do something impossible. After we watched the first debate, go back if you can, I believe that I said at that point that that's the guy that they should be rallying behind. I mean, he only spoke for about 7.5 seconds during that first debate, but if they'd cleared out the field earlier and you hadn't had Ted Cruz, who shouldn't have been the alternative to a crazy person shouldn't be another crazy person
right.
who is in different ways almost equally repulsive to
But
most
he, you know,
people.
the crazy person, the first one, Donald Trump, just to distinguish the crazy people, is a different kind of crazy than they've ever dealt with. So you had last time, you had Mitt Romney at the end, who was the Kasich, let's say, and then you had Rick Santorum, who was the Cruz this time. They do that dance a lot. Republicans do that dance. They've done it with Pat Buchanan and with Pat Roberts, but they don't with Pat Buchanan. There is a conservative, a Christian conservative, since about 88 or 92 that comes up and does that. But because of Trump, this time the sort of more moderate couldn't get through, and that's what crippled Kasich. But still, again, I say it again: 257 to 188. You don't have to win by much if you're John Kasich. You have to go to you haven't campaigned in these states. You didn't have a lot of money, but you might have been able to raise some money now with Cruz out of the race and people not wanting Trump. So he hasn't been to Oregon in a while. I don't know that he's been there. Even in the past, maybe in the past couple of weeks he went there once, right? Then why not start doing that now? I just don't.
Plus, Portland has a lot of great restaurants.
Yeah,
and he loves eating.
He can
loves
eat
to
his
eat.
way up and down the coast.
And he plays basketball. He ran the congressional basketball, and the Blazers are in the playoffs.
Again, this is a head scratcher.
This is a head scratcher. Continues to be. I hadn't even thought about the eating and the hoops.
There you go.
And not to mention,
Or as Cruz would say,
he
the
knows
rings.
it's a hoop, right? Yeah, he knows it's a hoop.
He knows it's a hoop, and not a.
I've never seen him hit
ring?
his wife.
No,
That would be an advantage
or elbow
for
her,
going forward. Or elbow.
What did he refer to it as?
A basketball ring.
Ring.
basketball
A
ring. Yeah.
Oof, that's right.
He's not a human. No, he's an alien doing a passable job.